Okay, so the next topic that we're going to look at is the collection of evidence, mainly looking at interview techniques. So we're going to look at kind of cognitive strategies relating to the collection of evidence. So the things that you're going to look at within this, so in terms of the background, we're going to look at the collection of evidence from both witnesses and suspects, and we're going to look at different techniques that are used. The key piece of research that we're going to look at is Memon and Higham, and they are looking at the cognitive interview, and then in terms of the application, what you'll be looking at in lesson is different strategies that can be used for police interviews. So I'm just going to leave this pinned up at the top. So in terms of looking at how we collect information from witnesses and suspects, you firstly really need to know the difference between a witness and a suspect, because the interviews that they receive will be different for obvious reasons. So a witness is somebody who saw or heard or otherwise witnessed a crime take place, whereas a suspect is a person of interest. So this person will be questioned by police and may take part in things like a lineup. So interviewing with a suspect is defined as questioning a person regarding their involvement or suspected involvement in a criminal offence, and this is done under caution. We'll talk about what that means shortly. But when you're interviewing a witness, it's a bit different, so it's more to gather details of their account of that offence. So just ever so slightly different. Now, when it comes to interview techniques, you collect evidence from suspects and witnesses in different ways. Now, interviewing witnesses often uses what you call a standard interview, but more recently has used a cognitive interview technique, which is a little bit different. So we're going to look at both the standard interview and the cognitive interview, and they're both used upon witnesses. But first, you can pause the video just here, because I first want you to fill in the booklet space where you are to recap Loftus and Palmer's study, and that will give you some indication of why we need to review these interviewing techniques. So you can pause the video just here in order to do that, please. Okay. So in the standard interview, so as I say, we'll look at these separately from each other. This type of interview often involves rapid fire questions. So in other words, kind of, one question after another, they're fairly quick fire. Now, these questions often, or these interviews rather, often have the following features. So they often involve asking questions not necessarily in a chronological order, so questions may be out of order. These can be conducted by people who have had very little training. They can ask whatever questions they feel are relevant, and interviewees are frequently interrupted, so their responses, the responses that are asked are often for short answer questions, but also the interviewee's responses may be cut short should the police investigator feel that there is kind of another additional question that feels relevant in that moment. They will often interrupt that with additional questions. So that is what happens in a standard interview quite often. Now, another technique is the cognitive interview. So in the cognitive interview, this is slightly different. So these are the four components of a cognitive interview. So interviewees are encouraged to report everything. So regardless of how relevant or accurate they think it is, they should give all information. The context is reinstated. So in other words, we kind of try to in some way mimic the context at which they experienced the initial event. So we can ask them to do things such as form an image of the original scene. So think about the location of objects in the room, or sounds or smells or other kind of physical conditions that they can remember. So the idea behind that being that if the context at which you're trying to recall information is matching the context at which you encoded the information, recall could be better. Recalling in a reversed order, so otherwise known as changing the order. So this encourages witnesses to, for example, they might start halfway through a sequence of events and work backwards towards or away from the most memorable event of all in that. And the idea behind that is that you might end up recalling additional details. So the idea behind it is that it is more effective to recall information in forward order once and then reverse order, so backwards, than it is to just recall it in forward order twice. You're more likely to pick up on details that you might have missed potentially. And then lastly, you've got recall from a different perspective. So this tries to encourage witnesses or suspects or whoever to try. And lastly, you've got recall from a different perspective. So this one really encourages witnesses to try and view the scene as other people who also then may have seen it. So for example, say you were the witness at a burglary in which you were a customer in the shop that was under attack, they may ask you to recall it from the perspective of the cashier, for example. So the aim of this is to use basically a number of kind of pathways to increase the retrieval of detail from witnesses. So I suppose if you're trying to think of something from somebody else's perspective, that may kind of mean that you have to kind of delve further to look for those details in your memory. So essentially, what occurs here is if you used each of these things individually, then they're not necessarily any better than that standard interview. And this isn't, unlike the standard interview, this isn't standardized as a technique. So in other words, it's more like a toolbox of skills, and the interviewer needs to be skilled in kind of deciding which is appropriate and which is helpful to use on a case-by-case basis dependent on that interview. But some research would suggest that when you use 2 or more components of those 4, there's a significant improvement in recall. And actually the report everything and the context reinstatements combination appear to be most effective. But overall, this does appear to be more effective than just the standard interview. So Fisher et al. Did some research in which they compared interviews done by police officers who were trained in using the cognitive interview technique. So wherever you kind of see CI in this PowerPoint, that means cognitive interview. So they were trained in the cognitive interview technique and they compared the recording of information from those interviews to those who were not trained in the cognitive interview technique, and they were interviewing real witnesses from a robbery in Florida, and they actually found that those who had been trained in the cognitive interview were able to record like 63% more information, so an increase of 63% worth of information, and that was established by some blind researchers. So in other words, the researchers at the University of California, when establishing who had recalled more information through their interview, weren't aware whether the interview that they were looking at was done by use of the cognitive interview or by a standard interview. So that just shows that it is fairly effective. What I would say as well, actually, is that techniques 3 and 4, or components 3 and 4 rather, are quite useful as well when you're trying to establish if somebody is lying. So usually if you are giving false details, then you've thought out those false details and you're presenting them in a certain way. But if you start to try and recall them in reverse order or recall them from the middle and work backwards, or if you're trying to get somebody to give those details from the perspective of somebody else, then actually that's where that information appears to fall apart a little bit. So it's useful to use the cognitive interview there as well. Now, I will put these additional links into Google Classroom or into your classroom space so that you can have a look at some of these videos. Now, these are some clips of a documentary that was done on the BBC about eyewitness testimony, and it is quite interesting, in which people were eyewitnesses to a crime and they had to try and identify who had committed that crime. So I will link all of those because they are really interesting, so you'll want to just watch them as well. Okay, now when you are interviewing suspects, you generally treat this in a slightly different way. So when you're interviewing suspects, you use a range of techniques as we're often trying to investigate things like, are they lying about whether they committed this crime or not, or where they were, and we use some techniques such as interrogation. Now, each of these are usually done under some kind of caution, what I mentioned earlier on, to a police caution. So it is not necessarily compulsory that you answer these questions, but there will be consequences if you don't answer the questions, and any kind of evidence that comes across in your answers, and even the fact that you've refused to comment on them, can be used as that evidence. So a couple of things that you just may have heard of in terms of police cautions. So in the UK, the standard police caution you will have heard of probably on TV and things like that, and hopefully not in person, is something along the lines of, you do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court, and anything you do say may be given in evidence. So in other words, you don't have to answer these questions, but if you don't, then that will say something about you. But also the things that you do say can be used as evidence as well. And in America, so in the United States, you will again probably have heard this, but their version of a caution is called the Miranda rights. So again, there's something along the lines of, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law, and you have the right to an attorney, and if you can't afford one, then one will be appointed for you. So again, it's saying that you have the right to not answer these questions, but again, if you don't, that'll say something about you, and anything you do say will be used as evidence. So kind of basically along the same lines, but different wording. So what we'll do is we're just going to look at detecting lies and interrogation when we are interviewing suspects separately. So in terms of detecting lies, most police officers, I would say, would like to think that they are fairly skilled in their ability to detect lies. Now, when we actually compare lie detecting skills of police officers against a control group of not police officers do perform better at this task. So they performed better than the level of 50% of the control group, as they were 66.2% accurate on lies and 63.6% accurate on truths. So in other words, we were by 60% able to establish whether a comment made by a suspect was a lie or a truth. So the experienced police officers were much better at detecting those lies. Now, when collecting these evidence from suspects, the police need this ability to enable them to detect whether someone is telling a lie or not. Now, they look for things like inconsistent responses. So have you said one thing in the answer to one question, but then said something contradictory in answer to another? And they also analyse things like body language cues as well. So, just some examples of things which are telltale signs of lying. Some things come down to tone of voice, unconscious choice of language. So, if you were kind of being quite factual in the way that you present information, so fairly emotionless, then that could be an indicator of lies. Lack of key details in their descriptions, an ability to recall minute by minute details, so kind of really small, minuscule, minute details that a truth teller would forget because they may be focusing on the big picture, pauses, hesitations, so ums and ahs and things like that, distancing themselves, so less use of the word I, and failing to describe feelings, so again the kind of unconscious choice of language rather than using emotional words. They might use like more factual information perhaps. We also can use techniques in interrogation. So interrogation is a little bit different to an interview. So interview techniques basically aim to use some element of psychological manipulation in order to get you to provide information. So by doing things like reinstating the context of a situation, that's an element of psychological manipulation, but it encourages you to just recall information. But they are non-accusatory, and it's kind of like just standard question and answer. So I will ask you a question, you will answer that question, I'll ask you another question. Interrogation is a little bit different. So interrogation is not really standard question and answer, and it is coercive. So in other words, it's trying to pressure you, and it is accusatory. So in other words, it's not saying, innocent until proven guilty, it's saying guilty until proven innocent. So in interrogations, the investigator will usually start by telling the suspect that there is no doubt as to their guilt. They'll make a series of statements that require basically no response, so we'll evidence that we're not really interested in their response because we've already established that you are guilty of this crime, essentially. And that's very different to the normal police interview. Now, this is designed to kind of create and increase that anxiety and arousal and stress. And while that is a criticism that some people say it leads to this kind of undue anxiety, a particular interview technique, so the Reid technique, continues to be one of the most commonly taught interview techniques in the US in terms of interrogating suspects. So again, any videos that are in the PowerPoint, I will link you to these separately, or you can just type the links in, it's up to you. But what I'm just going to go through is this Reid technique. So the Reid technique essentially outlines 9 steps of interrogation. So I'll just go through each of these 9 steps. So in step 1, the suspect is essentially kind of isolated, probably in a small room, maybe a bare room, sometimes a soundproof room. But essentially the purpose of this is for the interrogator to confront the suspect with a strong assertion of guilt. So in other words, we know that you are guilty. And this may be supplemented by things like incriminating evidence, and that may be kind of real evidence, or it may be kind of like contrived, or what you might call kind of consequential evidence. But we're essentially establishing we think you're guilty in this first one. In step 2, I'll just unpin this for a second. So in step 2, the interrogator is usually urging the suspect to kind of tell the truth, and minimises the seriousness of the offence, or offers kind of moral justifications. So that may be things like, well, we know you're only doing this out of self-defence, or that you are going to be okay if you just tell us what happened, things like that. Step 3. So in step 3, the interrogator basically will at this point start to kind of interrupt all efforts that the suspect may make to deny their involvement. So we're basically disregarding the comments that they are making. And then from this, we will then start to try and basically overcome the suspect's moral or factual or emotional objections that they make. So all these interruptions that they've made, we may essentially kind of give reasons why they could have committed the crime. So maybe you did it for this reason, maybe you did it for that reason. And we're trying to kind of use this to get them to move forward to making a confession and saying, yes, okay, that's the reason why I did it. So in the hope that eventually this suspect is going to give up trying to kind of interrupt and deny the guilt, but will essentially then accept those facts, things we're presenting as facts. Next, if they kind of start to be a bit passive and just kind of not answer questions, things like that, even though we're not really interested necessarily in their responses, so if they kind of stop engaging basically, then we reinforce how kind of sincere we are. So we kind of put the pressure back on to make sure that they are engaged and receptive to the interview. In step 6, we usually start to maybe show some sympathy and understanding. We're trying to encourage them to cooperate with all the things that we've already said. So in this, usually they're going to kind of become a bit quieter, maybe listen more, things like that. Step 7, we start to then offer kind of the alternative question, so 2 choices of what the suspect could do. So we essentially give like 2 guilty interpretations of the crime. One of these is more acceptable than the other, so they would both have the outcome of that suspect being guilty, but actually one is lesser than the other. And we're kind of saying you have this option. Or alternatively, you could just say you did it and this is the option that you have. And we're hoping that they'll, kind of take the one that is more acceptable, but whichever one they take, they will be admitting the guilt that they have. In step 8, we're trying to kind of now get the suspect to admit their guilt in front of witnesses. So usually this is kind of done by a couple of interviewers, or it could just be recorded, either kind of in sound or on video. So basically what we want in this is, if the suspect accepts the lesser alternative, then it's kind of like a preliminary admission of guilt. So it's kind of like, okay, yep, you've said you're guilty, we'll come back to this and we'll then look for like a more full admission with details about the crime. Or they could take the more severe one, but obviously that's likely to be rarer. And finally, the next thing is that this is then converted into a full written confession, and details of what and how and why this crime was committed are put together, so that this evidence will be credible in court, and then the suspect will then sign this confession so that they cannot retract it. So you can see how this is very much different to like the cognitive interview and the standard interview that are given, as it is really applying a lot of pressure, and as well as other elements of psychological manipulation, but it is coercive, in order to get an admission of guilt. But with these, there are risk factors. So it is likely in interrogation that innocent suspects are sometimes induced to confess to crimes that they didn't commit or have any involvement in. So because it is what you'd call like a guilt presumptive process, so you're presuming guilt before innocence rather than innocence before guilt, then actually we hope that an interrogator would be able to recognise that somebody is innocent at some point during the interrogation and then go back and reevaluate evidence. But there may be a number of factors that end up meaning that we get false confessions. So firstly, there's confirmation bias. Now, we've already talked about confirmation bias in previous topics, but essentially, if you have a belief as an interrogator when you go into an interrogation that this person is guilty of this crime, and you know this because of all the evidence that's laid out in front of you, then it is unlikely that interrogators are going to reevaluate their beliefs. So they may be affected by this confirmation bias, so they may interpret the behaviour of the suspect in a way that confirms their expectations. So all the things that we said about behaviours which relate to lying, things like body language, maybe sitting a little bit uncomfortably. If you're being interrogated, you're likely to sit uncomfortably anyway. However, we may say, well, they're sitting really uncomfortably, so that shows that they're guilty. So we kind of have that confirmation bias. Sometimes there is a willingness to comply, so you've got a researcher there. Now, this researcher basically said that some suspects are more vulnerable than others. So, in this piece of research, they established their own self-report measure that was basically called the suggestibility scale. So that was a measure of how compliant you are in social situations, so how likely you are to just go along with things. Now, this suggested that if you score in a certain way on this self-report measure, that might mean that you're quite vulnerable in these interrogations, because actually you want to avoid getting into any direct confrontation, and you want to please others and satisfy others, and then that may mean that actually you're more likely to make an admission of guilt when you are not guilty. And they've found some other factors, so things like having a low IQ may mean that you're vulnerable to being more willing to comply and less likely to argue your case, because if you have a lower IQ, they appear to be more open to the use of misleading post-event information and misleading questions and things like that. Another thing is having a psychological disorder. So again, if you have a psychological disorder, you may be a bit more susceptible to making a false confession. So again, you've got a piece of research there which basically said that offenders who had some kind of mental illness self-reported a 22% lifetime false confession rate. So in other words, we asked people who had committed a crime and also had a mental illness how often they had admitted to something that they hadn't actually done, and the average was 22% of the time. And lastly, you've got youth. So this study here is looking more at adolescents, so teenagers, and they may be more compliant and suggestible, and also their judgments are fairly immature, and that may mean that if you're making immature judgments, you are not judging what risk you are taking in the way that you should. Again, we've already looked at this earlier on in the course when we've looked at child, but adolescents are more likely to kind of be impulsive and take those risks. And actually, then this means that innocent adolescents aren't focused on those long-term consequences of admitting that they were responsible for a certain offence or involved in a certain offence, but instead will be more willing to say, yes, I was involved, so that they get out of that immediate uncomfortable situation of being interrogated. So, if you say to them as part of this interrogation, look, you can just say you're guilty now and then all of this will be over quite quickly, then they're more likely to say, yes, okay, fine, I did it, because it ends the short-term pain, but they don't think about the long-term consequences. So each of those really are some of the risk factors. Now, what we say is that once a crime has been committed and a case has been made against an offender, so once we've established that a suspect appears to be the offender, then the case will go to court, and the prosecution try and persuade a jury that the defendant is guilty, and the defence will try and persuade them that they're not guilty. The evidence that's being collected by police inspectors, from both witnesses and suspects through either of these interviews or interrogation techniques, can then be used to either support or defend the victims. So essentially, the idea is that it's important that we get that information right, basically, and that there's no kind of false confessions in there. Now, in your key piece of research is by Memon and Higham. So in Memon and Higham, it is actually, in terms of the research method, another unique one in the sense that it's a review article. So in other words, they review how effective the use of the cognitive interview is. So all of this is in your booklets. So if you just kind of scroll through in your booklets, there may be things that you want to add, but read through in your booklets as I'm talking through each of these and highlight, underline any key bits, etc. Okay, so as I say, this is a report or a review rather than a single piece of research that's done. So they review around 4 key themes related to the use of the cognitive interview. So there is a link there where you can access all the relevant details, but I'm just going to go through some of these things. So the 4 kind of key themes that were looked at really were how effective the cognitive interview technique is, just on its own. How able we are to compare cognitive interview with other interview techniques. Looking at this as a measure of memory, so how are we able to measure memory through this, and the quality of training present in interview techniques. So I'm just going to go through their kind of key points. So comments on how effectiveness appears to be demonstrated, or firstly they say there's a lot of methodological problems or a lot of methodological issues in actually being able to isolate the components of the interview in order to see how effective they are. Now what they said was that context reinstatement part of the cognitive interview, so where you try and match the contexts at which they actually saw or witnessed a crime with the ones in which they're recalling them, was the most effective where each of the components were used separately. But as I've previously said, using each of them separately isn't particularly effective overall as a process. It's better to use a combination, but that was the most effective out of the 4 on its own. Now, this research or this review did look at some research that used children who were between 5 and 8 years, and they had isolated the context reinstatement and the change perspective and the change order parts, and they compared children interviewed about what they had witnessed using just one of those 3 parts of the cognitive interview against a control group of children who were just told basically to try harder in recalling information. And actually they found that there was no real difference or significant difference between the effectiveness of the technique in terms of how much information was remembered. However, when we use the enhanced cognitive interview, which is a little bit different, there actually appears to be some kind of improved effectiveness in places. So for example, we've got that the enhanced cognitive interview is there to kind of focus on enhancing that communication between interviewer and witness, so like more rapport is built. The effectiveness of the cognitive interview appears to be improved by this interaction between context reinstatement and these improved communication techniques, and also we do use kind of mental imagery in there as well. So it probably is also worthwhile you knowing what the enhanced cognitive interview involves. So the enhanced cognitive interview was essentially the cognitive interview, but it was revised. So this now has 7 steps, or 7 phases rather. So you may want to make a note of these somewhere else. So the first phase is essentially about social dynamics. So it's about personalising the interview, establishing a rapport, and communication. The second is facilitating that communication and who has control over that interview. So the witness often is given control of the interview so that it enables them to really use that report everything function of the original cognitive interview. If they're in control, then they're more likely to make admissions of any kind. The third phase is free reporting and context reinstatement. And usually what we find is that the most accurate level of information is given at this point. In the fourth phase, we start to use a lot of open-ended questions. So that usually is there to prompt for detailed responses. So this may be when we also start to use that kind of recall in a different order idea, because actually then this is likely to potentially give you some more detailed information or find missing information. Again, the next phase, so phase 5, is where we start to introduce now follow-up questions, important follow-up questions that will delve for missing information if information is missing. Then next we have phase 6. Now phase 6 is about closure for the witness. So being a victim or a witness to a crime can actually be quite upsetting, and so actually you want to leave them in a positive frame of mind. So that's why phase 6 is about trying to give them some kind of closure. And then in phase 7, the interviewer then kind of evaluates all that information by listening to the recording or watching the recording. So evaluates the kind of accuracy in the information given, basically. So that's just how that enhanced cognitive interview is a little bit different to the original one. And as I say there, you can see that there is kind of context reinstatement, but also improved communication and things like that appear to show some improvements. When comparing this interview method, so the cognitive interview, with other interview methods, what they essentially said was that it's difficult to compare with the standard interview. So the main difference between the police's standard interview and the cognitive interview is the motivation of the witnesses. So in the cognitive interview technique, they're much more motivated because of the attention that they receive based on the information that they're given. So more than just pure question and answer, which is what's often involved in a standard interview, it's asking them to kind of go back over information, to recall it in a different order, to think about it in a slightly different way. Whereas in the standard interview, it's fairly quick fire. So it is difficult to actually compare those two because they are quite different. And so they said that essentially it was difficult to use that standard interview as a comparison. And also there's a lot of kind of undesirable characteristics associated with that standard interview. So interrupting witnesses frequently, and those rapid fire questions may actually disrupt the information that you're getting rather than be beneficial. And the fact that it's called a standard interview is a bit of a misnomer because it's not standardized at all. It's different for every interview. So in other words, they essentially said that you couldn't compare this to establish how effective the cognitive interview technique is because the original standard interview is so different. So you can't really use that as a control. So instead we have compared it to other things. So there is the guided memory interview, or GMI, Now, this doesn't ask very many probing questions in comparison to the cognitive interview, but it is affected by interviewer variables. But it is a lot, that should just say a lot, more similar to the cognitive interview than the standard one. And that's because it does suggest that we should reinstate some contextual information. Now, this would be, they said, reasonable as a comparison group for determining whether information is recalled in a more accurate way, or more information is recalled because of context reinstatement on its own, or whether it was the combination of techniques of the cognitive interview that meant that we got more information. So as they said, these two were relatively comparable with each other when you're looking for that particular finding, but they also said that there are potentially some more appropriate controls out there, because what you also want is an interview technique that builds a good rapport with the witness, as well, and then that may be more appropriate. So the last one that we look at is the structured interview. Again, that's similar to the cognitive interview in terms of effective interviewer skills. So it's normally done by experienced people who are experienced and able to then detect lies and use questioning techniques, but it doesn't employ the cognitive techniques that the cognitive interview does. So it's slightly better than the standard interview in the fact that it's non-interruptive, and it does use this good question, and it does kind of foster confidence in the witness, in their memory. But the context reinstatement, for example, isn't used in the structured interview, it's only used in the cognitive interview. So really, Memon and Higham basically said that with appropriate training, both the cognitive interview and the standard interview technique, those interviews could be effective, but because in the the structured interview, there is a complete absence of cognitive techniques. This is quite a good control in determining the role of cognitive techniques in how does that affect your recall of information. So basically, just in a summary, the standard interview not very useful as a comparison because they are quite different. Because the standard interview is quick fire, and the cognitive is more attention giving. Guided memory and cognitive interview both use cognitive techniques, so useful in establishing whether one cognitive technique on its own is useful or a combination is better. And the structured interview and cognitive interview both share good interviewing skills and rapport building and things like that, but in the structure there's no cognitive techniques, and in the cognitive obviously there is, so it enables you to compare those two things against one another. Next one, measuring memory performance. Okay, oops, too much. So in this, looking at memory performance, when we're measuring memory performance, we usually look at essentially the percentage of interview statements that are correct, or the absolute number of correct and incorrect statements. Now, one problem with this is that using this as a measurement of memory means that we are ignoring the amount and the nature of unreported information. So if you don't know that unreported information, then you don't know how accurately that person actually remembers the event. And then the last thing that they look at is the quality of training. So they basically make some suggestions about training and use of cognitive interview. So they suggest that the improved cognitive interview, so the enhanced cognitive interview, places cognitive demands on the interviewer more than the structured interviews, so it's kind of more complex because there's kind of memory questioning techniques being used, and therefore the quality and the quantity of training are key to its effectiveness. So actually there was kind of 3 recommendations that were made, and the first was that interviewers should be given adequate training in cognitive interview techniques, so they should have a 2-day training programme on how to do so, and that the quality of training needs to be considered in relation to kind of the resources, because obviously the resources may govern the quality of training. And then the last thing is that we should select people who are to be potential cognitive interviewers, and that is that we should kind of find people who have good questioning techniques and good interview techniques generally, and then try and guide them towards the role of investigative detective, whereas people who have kind of poor interviewing techniques, we should guide them towards other less interviewer based roles. But then this is kind of making an assumption that people who have lower skills within interview techniques are never going to improve those interview techniques, so suggesting that they wouldn't benefit from training, which they likely would. So yeah, those are kind of the recommendations that they made. So I think really the kind of final conclusion from that research is that when you're researching the effectiveness of the cognitive interview, this review seems to be inconclusive, so we need to do some further research into the effects of the cognitive interview upon memory. So we need to do some more research on how these elements of the cognitive interview work, so how the change of order actually could improve memory, so how does that actually work, how the change of perspective actually can improve your recall of events, rather than just trying to establish yes it does, no it doesn't. We're trying to do some potentially future research on how that works. So it's not yet clear how the cognitive interview relates to other interviewing types, because all those other interviewing types that we looked at are so different, it's difficult to establish what makes a suitable control group for comparison purposes, and that generally interviewers differ in their ability and their motivation to conduct a good interview, and therefore this kind of interviewer effect and interviewer bias may actually affect any comparisons that are made directly between different types of interviews. So it's worthwhile just adding those kind of conclusions to your booklets, but as I say, we'll pick up with this in lesson